Pesach is coming, and what we're going to do is we're going to try to unlock a key to telling the story effectively, whether we're telling it to ourselves, to one another, to our children, to our grandchildren, or to all of the above. And the title of this class is Telling My Story. Telling My Story. And we're going to do this from the perspective of what perspective is the story being told from. And I want to give you a cogent example of this. I recently met a person who I hadn't seen in many, many years. And as a person who I happened to have interacted with at one particular time, I happened to have fortunately helped that person significantly. And when I met the person and we were talking about past events, he vaguely remembered the time that he and I interacted, and he didn't remember at all that I'd helped him. Now, needless to say, I realized that from his perspective on his life, my intervening when I did was not that significant. Although when he thought about it a little bit more, he came back to me and thanked me, and that's not what this is about. What it's about is thinking about the following thing, that we have a tradition, the Torah teaches us that God literally took all of the rules of nature and shelved them in taking us out of Egypt. And therefore, God revealed that there is no power or force other than God's, supreme to God, so that could stand in the way of God's will. And that's the vision we have of the 10 plagues. That's the vision we have of the sea splitting. That's the vision we have of God swooping in and taking one nation out from another nation. And that's what we're sitting down to convey forward to the next generation on Pesach night. So let's think about it for a moment from God's perspective, from Hashem's perspective. God looks down on the earth and sees the Jewish people. We're scattered, almost half of us now thankfully live in the land of Israel, but we're virtually all over the world. And God sees us sitting down, and we're fulfilling a mitzvah of Magi to talk about going out of Egypt on Friday night, April 15th this year is when it comes out on the calendar. So God could see us saying, oh, by the way, tonight's the night, 3,334 years ago, God took us out of Egypt. So we're really appreciative of that. Or we could be evoking a sense of excitement, of presence, of not just remembering, but in a certain sense, reliving the exodus of Egypt. And obviously, from God's perspective, what would that mean? That would mean that what God did then remains vital and important in our lives. And we're going to develop that idea a little bit further. But now let's step back and think about from the perspective of performing mitzvot. There are really two mitzvot that we fulfill, biblical mitzvot, on the night of Pesach. There are more than 30 mitzvot that would pertain if the temple was in place and we were eating the Paschal lamb and we were going up to the temple, and we would have many, many, many more mitzvot. But the two that we're going to fulfill in our current state of affairs, whether you live in Israel or you live in San Diego, are number one, eating matzah, which is a commandment from the Torah biblically that we fulfill. And number two is Magi, telling the story of the Jewish people going out from Egypt 3,334 years ago. So let's just look at the perspective for one quick second here, and we'll share the screen here. This is the mitzvah in the Torah. Can everybody see it okay? The mitzvah in the Torah is, V'higadato levincho bayom hahu, lemor, and you shall explain to your child on that day, and that day means the calendar date that we went out of Egypt, the 15th of Nisan. It is because of what Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. Okay, so this is the source of the mitzvah, of one of the two mitzvahs that we fulfill on the night of Pesach. We're fulfilling that mitzvah. Interestingly, what does the Talmud say in Pesachim 16b? In each and every generation, a person must view himself or herself as though he personally left Egypt, that is, it is said, And you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So again, the perspective taking here in these sources is it happened to me. The perspective is going to be in the first person. I was taken out of Egypt. And what I dare say is that us telling this story has led to the Jewish people surviving through 3,334 years since that happened, sitting down to eat matzah, sitting down to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of us being redeemed from Egypt, is because we've been able to effectively do this. And although I couldn't find my calculation, I think that I remember that more than 70% of the Pesachs since we, the Jewish people, have left Egypt, we had our Seder in exile. Could be we were living in the land of Israel. Certainly people are going to be living in the land of Israel this 2 weeks from now when they sit down at their Seder. But we're still in Galut. The temple hasn't been rebuilt. We're still, our perspective is one in which the Jewish people are scattered all over the world. So what does that mean? That means that in a certain sense, 70% of the time, the ideas of being redeemed from Egypt and brought to the land of Israel are remote. They're not actualized. And yet we stand here today in 2022, 3,334 years after the exile, and we are asked to evoke a sense that I am telling you my story. And that's the title of this class, Telling My Story. So I want to ask really one provocative question, which I think will be key to us understanding how we can make the story of the Exodus from Egypt our own story. And it's so important because this way, when we sit on the Seder night and we share this story with our children, we fulfill what the commandment of the Torah is, that we're going to tell our children, we're going to explain to your child on that day, it is because of what Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. To the extent that we can accomplish that, that's the extent to which we will be successful in seeing to it that the legacy continues and that we, the Jewish people, continue to tell the story throughout history. So here's the one specific question. Now, we all have different levels of familiarity with the Haggadah, but let's just look at telling the story itself. Telling the story itself. So I would dare say that, and we're going to focus on this right now, we start telling the story after the four sons, and we discuss how and when we tell the story. Then we come to this point in the Seder where we say, Mitchila ovdei avodah zorah hayu avosenu. And for those people who want, we don't have a standard text here, but I'm a big fan of this art scroll Haggadah. It's titled The Haggadah. It's actually the first Haggadah that they published. And I know that there have been dozens and dozens since then. But if you turn in it to page 78, you have this as the beginning of the telling of the story from its cause, the beginning of the Jewish people, through history. Let's look at the text here. It reads as follows. In the beginning, our fathers were worshipers of idols. But now the ever-present has brought us to his service, as it is stated. And then we quote from the book of Joshua, chapter 24, sentence 4. And we can read it together right here on the screen, highlighted here on the screen. And I took your father Abraham from over the river, and I made him walk in all the land of Canaan. And I increased his seed, and I gave him Isaac. And I gave to Isaac Yaakov and Esau. And I gave to Esau Mount Seir in order that he inherit it. And Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. So what do we see here? We see here is an origin story, and we're quoting from the book of Joshua, chapter 24, where when the Jewish people happened to have entered the land right at the end of Joshua's life, Joshua spends time recounting the history of the Jewish people for them. Okay? So this is a very nice beginning. This is a nice story. You know, we gather our children around. We want to present to them the story of us going back out from Egypt, and we start at the beginnings. that we had an ancestor named Abraham. He lived on the other side of the river, separated from all the ideals of Judaism. And God's telling the story from God's perspective. I took your father Abraham from over the river. I made him walk in the land of Canaan. I increased his seed. I gave him Isaac. I gave to Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Esav 2 sons. I gave to Esav Mount Seir in order that he inherited. And Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt, and the Haggadah stops there. That's what they quote. And then we respond, it's not on the screen here, we say, Baruch, blessed is he who keeps his assurance to Israel, blessed is he. It's vague to understand what the assurance is. And from here, I really want to use a structure of a class given by Rabbi Foreman. And I can share with you the link. It's a multi-part presentation that he has on the Aleph Beta website. It really is where this idea is sourced from as far as my understanding. And I'm relying on his explanation, but I think this is the key. Because here's my question, and here's his question. If you look at the next verse there, if you look at the next verse, let me just clear this up. We read this sentence. If you look at the next verse, sentence 5 in Joshua says, then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with the wonders that I wrought in their midst, after which I freed you. So the provocative question to unlock the entire Haggadah for us this year is as follows. Why did the Haggadah, they refer to the Baal Haggadah, the author of the Haggadah, why did he only quote sentences 2, 3, and 4 and stop purposefully and not quote sentence number 5? And then go on and put in our mouths, blessed be he who keeps his assurance Israel. What's the assurance? What is the assurance here? So I want to pause for a moment. I want to stop the share so I can see, does anyone have a possible explanation you would like to give to answer this question? If you do, please unmute yourself and speak up. Anybody have an idea why in the world would the person writing the Haggadah go to the trouble of saying, I'm going to tell you the story, because that's the mitzvah you're fulfilling, and I'm going to reach out to the book of Joshua, and I'm going to tell you from chapter 24, I'm going to quote it. And why would the Haggadah stop one verse short of talking about Moses and Aaron coming and bringing the Jewish people out of Egypt? Would anybody like to share a thought here, please?
Well, I do have a question. You mentioned something about God giving an assurance. Could you say where that's from and what the line is again?
Sure, that's the next words in Haggadah. I'm sorry, I didn't include that in the share. But literally, when we finish this quote in the Haggadah on page 82 in the Haggadah I'm talking about, and you turn the page, the next thing we say is Baruch Shomer Havtachato Yisrael Baruch Hu. Blessed is he, God, who keeps his assurance to Israel. Blessed is he. For the Holy One, blessed be he, planned the end of their bondage in order to do as he had said to our father Abraham at the covenant between the pieces. And it goes on to talk about that. So it almost, the question really has a lot of power to it. If the author of the Haggadah would only have finished the thought that Joshua was putting out there, then I would know what we're talking about when it says, blessed is he who keeps his assurance. But without that, I don't know what that is.
Well, I guess at the covenant between the parts,
right,
there were 2 assurances given to Abraham. One is that he would increase his seed, right, and the other is that he would go down to Egypt and be enslaved there, and then after 400 years he would be freed. The Jewish people would be freed. So maybe the assurance in this case is referring only to increasing the seed, and that's why he stopped at that point and did not go into freeing them from bondage.
But does that explain why the Haggadah didn't quote the 5th sentence?
No.
And if the effort here is Magi to tell the story, again, we'll go back to that, to our goal here. The whole statement of what we're doing on the Haggadah is we want, and you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of what Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. So why would and because even if they want to then refer to the covenant between the parts, the Brit Ben Abitarim, which it does talk about, complete the thought and then say, blessed be God. And not only that, it was a short Avram from the beginning. I understand how you can cobble these parts together, but this question remains an important question to me and to Rabbi Foreman. And I wanted to suggest an answer, but I really would like, does anyone else, or Frank, do you have another thought that you want to share?
I don't.
Okay.
So isn't it always the case that when we don't see why things are there or why things are missing, the answer is so the children will ask questions.
The answer is what? I just didn't hear the audio so well. The answer is what?
So the children will ask questions.
Oh, okay. We do want to provoke questions. We do want to provoke questions. So I guess to the extent that we are the children, we're asking a question here. So unfortunately, since we're not only the children here, we're going to have to do our best to answer our own question, which the children do also in Haggadah, So let's look at this. Here's what I want to suggest. Let's go back and look at the statement of Joshua. I wish I could make this bigger on your screen so you could see it more, but can everyone see okay this Joshua 24:2? I want to point something out here.
Right now, I don't see any text.
Thank you very much. I neglected to share the screen. Now you can, right?
Yes, yes.
Erase all the other, so we're not confusing anybody. And we're just looking at right here. We're just looking at this highlighted section. Okay, so we're going to look now at the 3 verses from Joshua that the Haggadah does quote, and I want us to think about something. Let's read them. I'm going to read them to you a little differently than I read them before. Joshua is assuming God's voice, and Joshua says, "And I took your father Avram from over the river, and I made him walk in all the land of Canaan, and I increased his seed. And I gave him Yitzchak, and I gave Yitzchak Yaakov and Esav, and I gave Esav Mount Seir in order that he inherited it, and Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt." What's the contrast in these phrases that becomes so apparent when you isolate these 3 sentences and you look at them in this way? Please.
Well, from the emphasis you put on the pronoun I, the first few verses talk about what God did, and the last verse talks about what Yaakov and his sons did.
Great. That's exactly what I wanted. And correct. So therefore, you see, because the Haggadah purposely, and I'm going to unbold sentence, I'm trying to unbold sentence number 5. Let me just see if I can do that now. I unbolded sentence number 5. What the Haggadah wants us to think about very profoundly here is the following: that God found Abraham. Now we know that Abraham found God, so I understand that Abraham went through a long stretch of time where he believed in God, he was willing to sacrifice on behalf of God's honor, where he taught people vigorously about God. That's not really written into the Torah, but that's the backstory that we know about. But then God does come to Abraham, and God does tell him to leave his land. God promises up front 2 things to Abraham: that I will give you many, many descendants, and that you will inherit the land. And that's all the I statements we have there. When it comes to Yaakov and his sons going down to Egypt, though, was that something that God promised or didn't promise? What do you think?
I thought I recall from the covenant between the parts that God did say the Jewish people would be enslaved for quite a long period of time.
Right, there was a prophetic vision. And just for me to check, can you see me and the text both somehow?
Yes.
Okay, good. So there was a prophetic vision given to Abraham at the covenant between the parts, which is referred to next in the Haggadah. But what jumps out at us from this quote from the book of Joshua is the following thought, that I, God, conveyed immense blessing on Abraham, and then I promised him children, and he had these children, even though he had his first son when he was 99 years old, when Isaac was born, and then he lived to see that his son Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. And then the Jewish people go down to Egypt. Why? Because they weren't ready to inherit the land. Do you hear that from this? They weren't ready to inherit the land. And that was the prophetic vision that he got, that was given to Abraham right from the get-go. And of course, it's a tremendous credit to Abraham that he was willing to become God's partner in the world, knowing that his children would be descended into Egypt and that they would suffer for 400 years, and then they would be redeemed. And in spite of that, he was willing to buy into it. But the main import here is what's following. That, well, let me ask you a different question. I'm sorry. Let me regroup a little and ask you the following questions. What brought Jacob and his sons down to Egypt? What brought Jacob and his sons down to Egypt?
The proximate cause was the famine.
Okay. Okay.
Well, no, it was the son. It was Joseph.
What I would dare to say is that it was the selling of Joseph by his 10 brothers into slavery that created the scenario which sent Joseph down to Egypt. God created a famine to, so to speak, reunite the Jewish people. And all those circumstances which caused them to realize that they were going to make it together or they weren't going to make it at all. And then the Jewish people went down to Egypt. And when Jacob and the Jewish people go down to Egypt, and Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt, it was because there was a famine, but it was overwhelmingly to reunite themselves with their brother Joseph, who had become the ruler of Egypt. Can we agree to that? So what I want to point out here, I want to create a thesis here, which I think is the central idea of the Haggadah, and that is this: that in choosing Abraham and miraculously providing children to Isaac, and miraculously providing Abraham and Sarah with a child Isaac, and in Isaac also unnaturally giving birth to Jacob and Esau. Esau separates himself from the Jewish people. He leaves to go to Mount Seir. Jacob therefore remains as the single inheritor of the faith of Abraham. And it's through the divisiveness of the Jewish people that Yaakov and his sons end up down in Egypt. And therefore, a theme of the Haggadah is this: that the Jewish people that could have fulfilled perhaps Abraham's vision of having children and inheriting the land without the circuitous route of being enslaved in Egypt. That wasn't dictated by God. That ultimately was dictated by the fact that we, the Jewish people, required that chastisement in order to reorganize ourselves after the sale of Joseph to Egypt, after the sale of Joseph by his brothers. And it was repairing that brought us down to Egypt. And then the enslavement cemented our unity as a people. And then we, the Jewish people, were redeemed and set free, because ultimately God's promise to Abram is children and land. And what God was explaining is that I will see to it that my promise is fulfilled, regardless to how circuitous the route needs to be, and regardless of how difficult you, the Jewish people, make it for me to fulfill the ultimate destiny of the Jewish people. And with this, you see, this explains why the structure of our Seder is built around the knowledge and understanding that the Jewish people are going to be in exile and they're going to be telling their story of redemption while still in exile. And in fact, there's a source in Maimonides when he begins talking about the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Maimonides says explicitly that we have a Haggadah, we have a storybook, which we use on Passover, and it's meant to be used throughout our exile. That's the way he bookends the Haggadah itself. And you see, this leads us back to this idea of, the idea of what this is that has stood for us in all times. Because the next thing we say, Frank, remember we talked about is that Vihi Sha'amda, Lavosenu V'lanu. This is what has stood for us, our ancestors, for all of us, since it is not only one person that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in each generation they stand against us to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed be He, rescues us from their hand. Now, God is not promising us that there will always be people persecuting us. That's not something that God promises for us. But what God is explaining to us here is that I will build in a mechanism of history, which is that the Jewish people will forever remain intact and have their integrity and survive all the way through history. That's God's promise to us. That's his promise to Abraham. Ultimately, Abraham will have descendants, and those descendants will inherit the land. For 70% of the time since then, we have not inherited the land. Okay? We did when Joshua brought the people into the land, and we lived there for about 1,000 years during the time of the judges, and then they built the first temple. We went into exile only for a brief period of time, 70 years, to Babylonia. We came back, we built the second temple. We were there for another 420 years. And then we went back into exile, and exile had existed since the year 70 in our calendar, which means for 1,950 years since then. So the Haggadah is trying to highlight one essence to us, and that is this. We stand in the midst of a long, belabored journey. But just as that journey was foretold to Abraham, there would be a significant, long period of exile, and the Jewish people would be persecuted, that they would then leave and return back to the land of Israel. That's Vihi Sha'amda Lavosenu V'lanu. This same guarantee stands for us today. And therefore, you and I sitting here today, this is my story. And I really can tell my story in this light. I'm not telling my story tonight to my kids, but the fact that we're sitting together at the Seder table, the fact that we're sitting down and we're saying Magid, we're going to recount, we're going to fulfill the mitzvah of explaining to your child on that day, it is because what Hashem did for me when I went free from Egypt. Me, it's my story. Me, because how are we possibly sitting here today after all of the different episodes of Jewish history that have unfolded? How could we cling to a promise of ultimate redemption today when for 3,334 years, we've only lived 30% of our time as one people in the land of Israel? Are we kidding ourselves? No, we're not kidding ourselves, because the unfolding of this story from the perspective of what Joshua unlocks for us here is the following: that it's our story. We make good choices, we make bad choices. We at times build up the Jewish people, and we bring about steps toward redemption. And at times we lose our way and we lose our journey. But no matter how far we lose our way, even if it's the extent of selling our own brother into slavery and causing such a division and such a disruption in the family of Abraham, which has a quest and a journey to make in history, even going to those lengths, God will see to it that heaven and earth will be turned over in such a way that we will be redeemed. And that's the Vihi she'amdo avotenu v'lanu. This has stood for our ancestors, for us. The ultimate testimony, according to Rav Yaakov Emden, is we're sitting down to tell the story. And he writes explicitly that you and I, sitting down with our families in another 10 days from now, and having a Seder, and eating matzah, and telling our story to our family. Our story is we remain Jews. We remain expectant of the redemption. We remain understanding that, yes, there's a lot of difficulties in the world. Yes, things seem very precarious. I mean, if anything, and we just imagine the really dark, dark periods of Jewish history when they didn't have a land of Israel under Jewish control, or when the Jewish people were being mercilessly persecuted, or when the future of the Jewish people really, really seemed in doubt. Even at those times, Vihi she'amdo avotenu v'lanu, God stands by us. And that original promise to Abraham, no matter how far the journey takes us, no matter to what extent we find ourselves far off the beaten path, so to speak, God will see to it that the children of Abraham who cling to this hope of redemption and cling to this game plan that God has put forward in the world, we will succeed. And ultimately we will return, and all the promises to Abraham will be fulfilled just as they were fulfilled 3,334 years ago. So hence this becomes my story. I'm telling it to my children in the way that I feel that I'm in the story. I'm not outside talking about something. I'm inside the story, sharing it with my children so that they also will have this story as their own for the future. Happy to answer any questions if you'd like to ask any. Okay, we will regroup again, please God, next Tuesday. I expect there'll be a class, even though we're getting close to everybody heading out of town, and hope we'll revisit Pesach from a different perspective then. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
That was really
Thank
nice.
you.
Bye-bye.